Kyle Simmons wasn't afraid of a stupid dare. That's what he told himself anyway, as he stood outside the crumbling husk of Blackwood Middle School. The place had been abandoned for 40 years, left to rot after a fire took out half the west wing. But the real reason nobody went near it wasn't the fire. It was the stories. They locked kids in there, Matt had told him earlier that night, grinning in the firelight. Bad kids, ones the teachers couldn't handle, stuck them in a special detention room and left them. But sometimes, the kids never came back out. Kyle had rolled his eyes, but now, standing in the shadow of the building, a sick feeling curled in his gut. "You got 10 minutes, Matt said, setting a timer on his phone. "Go in, find the old detention room, take a pic and get the hell out." Kyle squared his shoulders and pushed the rusted double doors open. The air inside was stale, thick with dust and the scent of rotting wood. His phone's flashlight barely cut through the gloom, revealing rows of broken lockers, scattered papers, and overturned desks. A faded banner clung to the ceiling by a single corner. Blackwood Wildcats, Champions 1984. He moved cautiously, the only sounds his breathing and the crunch of debris under his sneakers. The school had that strange, abandoned stillness, like a place holding its breath. His light skimmed over a row of old class photos, their frames tilted, glass cracked. The faces inside stared blankly, their eyes milky with age. Then he saw it. Detention. The sign was still bolted above the door. Unlike the rest of the school, the door was intact, the small window at the top grimy but unbroken. Kyle hesitated. His heartbeat thumped against his ribs. Every part of his brain screamed don't, but his hands had already pushed the door open. The room was cold, colder than the rest of the school. The air felt thick, pressing against his skin like damp fabric. Rows of desks sat perfectly in place, untouched by time. The chalkboard still had writing on it. "Be quiet. Sit still." Kyle lifted his phone to snap a picture. That's when he heard it. A whisper, faint, like wind through dead leaves. But it wasn't the wind. It was words. "You're late." Kyle spun around. The desks were no longer empty. Students sat hunched over them, their faces obscured by long, matted hair, their skin gray and peeling like old wallpaper. The air grew thick, humming with something electric and wrong. The chalk on the board moved, scrawling a new sentence in jagged strokes. No talking, no leaving. Kyle stumbled back, his breath coming in short gasps. His fingers fumbled for the door handle. It wouldn't budge. The whispering grew louder. Desks scraped against the floor as the figures rose, their hollow eyes locked on him. Kyle pounded on the door. "Matt, let me out!" But Matt wasn't there anymore. The light in the hallway flickered. Kyle's screams echoed through the school, swallowed by its walls. His hand scraped at the door, but it wouldn't give. The room seemed to stretch, pulling at the edges of reality like something hungry. The students shuffled closer, their movements stiff and unnatural. One of them, a girl in a tattered school uniform, reached out a skeletal hand. Kyle flinched, but he couldn't move. His feet were rooted to the spot. "Please," he whispered, his voice cracking. The girl tilted her head, her lips peeled back in something that might have been a grin. Then she whispered back, "We needed a new one." A force stronger than anything Kyle had ever known gripped him, dragged him toward the desks. His limbs went numb, his breath shallow. The girl pointed to a seat at the front of the class. His seat. Kyle collapsed into it, his body locking in place. His mind screamed, but his mouth couldn't form the words. The chalkboard wiped itself clean. New writing appeared, slow and deliberate. "Welcome, Kyle." The students sat down. The room was silent again. Kyle tried to move. He couldn't. His hands gripped the desk, fingers stiff. His skin felt wrong, cold, paper thin. His breathing slowed, his heartbeat barely there. The faces around him weren't strangers anymore. They were familiar. They were his classmates. And then Kyle understood. He wasn't leaving, ever. The door creaked open. Somewhere outside, Matt's voice called his name. The students all turned in unison, staring toward the door, waiting. No one had stepped foot in Holloway High School for nearly 30 years, not since the night Principal Edwin Graves disappeared. The town whispered about what had happened that stormy evening in 1995. Some said he ran away, others believed he was murdered. But the real horror, the one that kept the doors chained and the windows boarded, was the stories of those who had heard his voice echoing through the abandoned halls, long after he was gone. Josh and his friends had heard the legends, but they weren't the type to scare easy. So, when Robbie suggested they sneak in for a live-streamed ghost hunt, Josh had shrugged. One night in a creepy old school, we'll be out before midnight. They should have left the moment they climbed through the broken window. The air inside was thick, stale, heavy with the scent of mold and something faintly metallic. Their flashlights flickered against the graffiti-covered lockers, illuminating words long since scratched into the metal. He never left. "Creepy," Maya muttered, running her fingers over the rusted doors. "Guess the legend still gets people talking." Robbie grinned. "Let's split up, cover more ground." Josh sighed. "Have you never seen a horror movie?" But they did it anyway. Josh wandered toward the administrative offices, stepping over broken tiles and forgotten lesson plans. The school had been frozen in time. Desks still held old textbooks, bulletin boards displayed announcements from a year that didn't matter anymore. Then, a sound, faint, distant, a deep, gravelly voice humming a tune, the school song. Josh stopped cold. His heart pounded in his ears. Then came the footsteps, slow, measured, echoing through the empty halls. "Robbie," Josh whispered. The footsteps stopped. Silence swallowed the school whole. Then, the voice, low and commanding, thick with authority. "Detention! Now!" Josh turned and ran. He sprinted down the corridor, breath hitching in his throat until he found Maya standing at the entrance to the gym. "We need to go," he gasped. She frowned. "Where's Robbie?" Then they heard it. The rhythmic tap of dress shoes against linoleum. A shadow passed at the end of the hallway. Tall, broad, wearing what looked like a dark suit. "Who's that?" Maya whispered. Josh didn't answer, because he already knew. The intercom crackled to life, the speakers screeching from decades of disuse. Then, his voice, calm and cold. "You were warned." The lights flickered. The hallway behind them stretched, elongating into something unnatural. The doors slammed shut one by one, and then Robbie screamed. They found him in the principal's office, standing stiff, his back to them. The old wooden desk sat untouched, covered in dust, except for one thing, a single detention slip, ink still wet. Robbie Turner, detention. Josh reached for his friend's shoulder, but when he turned him around, Robbie's face was wrong. His mouth moved, but the voice that came out wasn't his own. "No running in the halls." The door slammed behind them. The last thing Josh saw before the darkness swallowed them whole was the figure stepping out from behind the desk, his old nameplate glinting under the flickering light. Principal Graves. Josh awoke to an eerie stillness. The air smelled of old paper and dust, but something else too. Ink. Wet ink. His hands trembled as he wiped sweat from his forehead, only to find black ink smeared across his skin. The room was different now. It wasn't abandoned anymore. It was pristine. The walls were lined with perfectly arranged books, the wooden desk polished and without a single speck of dust. Outside the office windows, the hallway no longer looked derelict. The lockers gleamed, the posters on the walls fresh, the overhead lights humming softly. Except something was off. The silence wasn't normal. It was expectant. Robbie sat at the desk, eyes vacant, hands folded neatly in front of him. Maya was gone. Josh tried to move, but his body felt sluggish as if he were underwater. He turned, his breath catching in his throat. Principal Graves stood in the doorway, hands clasped behind his back, his suit crisp and dark. His eyes, deep, hollow voids, studied Josh with quiet amusement. "You students never listen," he said softly, stepping closer. "There are rules in this school." Josh tried to scream, but the sound lodged in his throat. Graves reached into his suit pocket and pulled out a slip of paper. He placed it on the desk in front of Josh. Josh didn't need to read it to know what it said. Joshua Miller. Detention. His limbs turned ice cold, his fingers twitched involuntarily. He tried to stand, but his body no longer belonged to him. Graves smiled. "Welcome to Holloway High." The office door creaked open behind him, revealing a long hallway filled with students. Not students. Shadows in the shape of students. Their eyes empty, their bodies still. Waiting. The intercom buzzed again. "Attention students," Graves announced, his voice rolling through the walls. "We have 2 new arrivals. Please welcome them accordingly." Josh felt himself stand. He didn't will it to happen, but his body obeyed. His feet carried him toward the door. Robbie followed. They stepped into the hall, where the shadows parted to let them in, and then the doors slammed shut. Outside, the school remained lifeless, its walls cracked, its windows dark. But if you listened closely, just past the sound of the wind, you could hear the intercom buzz, and the principal's voice giving one final warning: "No running in the halls."